This is part of a project, a little book that I'm writing on Benjamin's literary criticism, in particular, his German literary criticism, really from the early work, in particular the early essay on Hölderlin, but also some of the earlier, very early student writings that lead up to that interesting essay, through his Baroque book. And in some ways, this project will end with Benjamin's essay on Proust from 1929, toward the image of Proust. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the dissertation, which I think some of you probably know, and I should apologize in advance if some of the allusions here are somewhat obscure, because some of this is a little bit technical, because it has to do in part with the kind of intellectual context of the teens and 20s in Germany, in which I'm arguing Benjamin articulates an important critique of German academic literary criticism. And I think as I move through my paper, it'll become clear where I'm going with that. So let me begin with a quotation. Benjamin's early intellectual concerns and ambitions are those of a Germanist, deeply read in German Baroque, classical, and Romantic literature. To ignore this is to falsify the image of Benjamin. Close quote. René Welleck, Sterling Professor of Comparative Literature at Yale, and perhaps the most influential historian of literary criticism of the second half of the 20th century, wrote these sentences in 1971. Welleck's intention was to supplement, if not to undercut, the two dominant images of Benjamin that were guiding the reception of his work, beginning especially in the 1960s. That of the politically engaged Marxist cultural critic on the one hand, and that of the Jewish mystic on the other. In place of these images, or in addition to them, Welleck wants to insert that of the Germanist, especially on the basis of Benjamin's early work. Although it draws our attention to the fundamental importance of the German literary tradition to his development, this observation provides no insight into Benjamin's, quote, early intellectual concerns and ambitions, unless we recognize the essentially critical point of view animating his relation to academic German studies. Benjamin's critical perspective on the Germanistic of his day can be seen subtly and even surreptitiously at work in what might appear to be his most conventional and certainly his most successful, indeed his only successful, piece of academic literary criticism, his doctoral dissertation on German Romantic literary criticism. In keeping, it would seem, with the conventions of such a formal academic exercise, the dissertation, a literary critical study of the concept of literary criticism, begins by reflecting on the limitations of its method and scope. Yet this is not merely a matter of academic decorum. Benjamin's project, as we will see, is all about self-limitation, and here the word self-limitation is translating Selbstbeschränkung. Much of what I'll have to say here has to do with Selbstbeschränkung and various variations on that term. The emphatic care given to the limits placed on the project itself in the introductory paragraphs, which is entitled Delimitations of the Question, Einschränkungen der Fragestellung, contributes to the sense of disciplinary rigor that would have been expected of a PhD thesis submitted to the University of Bern in 1919. And indeed, Benjamin's dissertation exceeded expectations and was awarded the citation of summa cum laude. Yet, as I will argue, the stress on the limitations that lend coherence to the work also points to the obstacles standing in the way of a true understanding of what is most important about Romantic criticism from Benjamin's critical point of view. In this sense, the constraints placed on the dissertation, as Benjamin underlines in its opening pages, restrict the thesis to a contribution only of what he calls materials, materialien, for the definition of the essence of Romanticism, and preclude inquiry into the determination of what he calls its point of view, which is here Gesichtspunkt. This point of view, Benjamin states, quote, may be sought in romantic messianism, close quote. This statement, contained in a footnote and relegated to the margins of the dissertation, corresponds to the point of view developing in Benjamin's own broader critical project during these years. This correspondence thus raises the possibility that the restrictions imposed on the dissertation, which seem to give a nod to scholarly prudence and convention, might also exclude its author's own critical point of view. This is the thesis explored in what follows, namely that Benjamin's critical study of the romantic concept of literary criticism is designed simultaneously to outline and to underline the limitations of academic literary criticism. Or, as Samuel Weber has elegantly put it, quote, Benjamin's professionally done dissertation, as the eminent Germanist Peter Demetz has characterized it, was thus intended to lead its readers to the limits of its explicitly treated subject matter and point them beyond in the direction of an esoteric dimension that transcends the purview of traditional scholarly discourse, close quote. And that's from Sam Weber's book, Benjamin's Abilities. Approached in this way, Benjamin's dissertation may be said to delimit literary criticism, emphasizing the prefix in a way that is characteristic of all of his critical work on German literature throughout his early years. My goal here is to begin to specify the critical engagement of Benjamin's dissertation with the authoritative sources of German studies in this period, and to suggest how what Weber describes as the esoteric dimension of this work, citing a 1918 letter from Benjamin to Scholem, is connected to a philology of life, or what I would call a biophilology, traversing his early literary criticism. And that's the working title of this project, Biophilology, which is a sort of transposition of, for those of you familiar with Lebensphilosophie, the German of biophilology would be Lebensphilologie. So playing here off of Lebensphilosophie, which I won't have much to say about here today, but which we can talk a little bit about later if we have time. Not a history of the concept of criticism, not a study of the place of Romanticism in the history of philosophy, also not an investigation into Romanticism from the perspective of the philosophy of history, or an attempt to represent, quote, the historical essence of Romanticism. This dissertation is understood, as Benjamin insists in its first sentence, as what he calls a problem historical investigation. Quote, the present work is conceived as a contribution to a problem historical investigation, close quote. The term, somewhat awkwardly translated as problem historical, Problemgeschichtlicher, inscribes Benjamin's critical project in the broader debate spurred by the work of Max Weber and neo-Kantians such as Wilhelm Windelband and Heinrich Rickert, surrounding the question of the scientific status of the human and cultural sciences that emerged in the German university of the later 19th century. With regard to problem history, in other words, problems anchored in communal commitments and thus collective values allow cultural material, from the point of view of these neo-Kantian critics and Weber, to be raised above the status of mere empirical facts and enable the historical study of the human sciences to attain what Weber, drawing on neo-Kantianism, did not hesitate to call objectivity. This was the proposition developed especially by Rickert on the basis of Windelband's work. The neo-Kantian background on which Benjamin's dissertation draws in order to frame its approach is clearly visible in the two main parts of the study, the first being devoted to reflection, the second to criticism. With respect to the section on reflection, which starts with Fichte, Benjamin cites Windelband's exposition of what will become the key source of the objection leveled by the Romantics at the author of the Wissenschaftslehre, namely Fichte, namely the latter's emphasis on unconscious representation in the self-limitation of the I by the non-I in reflection. I'm not going to be able to go into a lot of details here, so I just keep moving. We can come back to that if there are questions. Benjamin quotes from the extensive account of this logic in Fichte provided by Windelband in the second volume of the 5th edition of Windelband's influential Geschichte der neuen Philosophie, which appeared in 1911. I'm underlining there the 5th edition because Windelband's work was extremely influential during this period. It went through many editions, the most recent one being the 5th when Benjamin was writing. Quote here from Benjamin. It will prove important for the relation between the Fichtean and the early Romantic theories of knowledge, Benjamin observes, that the formation of the non-I in the I rests on an unconscious function of the latter, close quote. This remark is immediately followed by 2 quotations from Windelband, with the second one concluding that Fichte sees, quote, the only way out for the explanation of the given content of consciousness in the fact that the latter stems from a representing of a higher sort, a free, unconscious act of representing, close quote. By contrast, Benjamin notes, quote, the Romantics shudder at limitation through the unconscious. And here, limitation is Beschränkung. With respect to the second of the 2 main parts of the dissertation, which focuses on criticism, Rickert's philosophy makes a more surreptitious appearance, but at a similarly crucial juncture. Unlike the reflecting I that is limited by the unconscious representation of the non-I, the reflective medium of the work of art is not limited, but infinitely completed through the intervention of criticism. Completion here translates the German Vollendung. Benjamin quotes Novalis on such completing critical interventions. Quote from Benjamin, they represent the pure, completed character of the individual work of art, close quote. Yet the noun completion, Vollendung, employed by Benjamin and not by Novalis, in fact, anywhere as far as I can tell, clearly invokes Rickert, who made this term the key to his value philosophical system, as some of you probably know. Moreover, the ambiguity of Vollendung, completion, on which Rickert insists, the ambiguity both as consummation and consumption, completing and completely ending, is discovered by Benjamin in the Romantic concept of criticism. Quote, thus, entirely in contrast with the present-day conception of its essence, Benjamin writes, criticism in its central intention is not judgment, German here is Beurteilung, but on the one hand, completion, Vollendung, expansion, Ergänzung, and systematization of the work, and on the other, its dissolution or resolution in the absolute, close quote. Let us take a minute to specify more exactly the way Benjamin's approach to reflection and criticism in Romantic theory follows these neo-Kantian sources in order precisely to underline where he diverges from their limitations. Again, surreptitiously. The part of the thesis here is that the whole dissertation is a kind of way of passing by alluding to these neo-Kantian sources as though they are the authorities on which he's basing his dissertation, while at the same time make a completely different argument from the argument that they're actually making in their work. On the basis of a very limited number of sources, Friedrich Schlegel's essays and fragments from the Athenaeum, and excerpts from the writings of Novalis from this same period, and more precisely on the foundation of what Benjamin calls certain epistemological presuppositions, in fact, that Schlegel, he admits, had not laid down, that's a quote, at the time when these writings were published, before and around 1800, Benjamin proposes that the Romantic concept of criticism becomes a philosophical problem. That's a fairly long quote from Benjamin. Friedrich Schlegel's theory will be presented in the following as the Romantic theory of criticism. The justification for designating this theory as the Romantic theory rests on its representative character. Not that all the early Romantics declared themselves in agreement with it or even took notice of it. Friedrich Schlegel often remained unintelligible even to his friends, but his view of the essence of criticism is the final word of the Romantic school on this matter, very Benjaminian locution. Continuing with Benjamin. Along with Friedrich Schlegel's writings, only those of Novalis come into consideration as textual sources in the narrow sense for this presentation, whereas Fichte's earlier writings present indispensable sources, not for the romantic concept of criticism itself, but for its comprehension. So in other words, many of you may be writing dissertations now. You can try to write a dissertation claiming that you're writing about something as large as German romantic literary criticism, the concept of criticism, and then you narrowing it down to a very limited number of sources, and you're claiming nevertheless that even though the Romantics themselves didn't recognize that this was their concept of literary criticism, that in fact this is the last word, as Benjamin says, summa cum laude in Bern. Thus, Benjamin takes as the basis of his dissertation a highly circumscribed set of texts, and more specifically, a definitive philosophical system that had not been laid down and that had remained unnoticed by the Romantics as the romantic theory of criticism. The representative character, as Benjamin calls it, of this theory is simply declared. The early writings of Fichte are also an indispensable source, however, not for the romantic theory of criticism itself, but for an understanding of it. Understanding the romantic critical theory as a philosophical problem presupposes that art is a manifestation of thinking, and in particular of the capacity of thinking to reflect on itself, what Kant called reflective judgment. According to Fichte, reflection discloses the purely formal dimension of thinking. It reveals that thinking involves, in addition to content, also form. Science for Fichte includes knowledge not only of things, but of the way things are known. This reflexive knowledge of knowledge makes the action or form of thinking into its content. The dizzying reversibility of form and content in pure reflection draws thinking into a cycle of potentially endless thinking about itself, as Benjamin notes with regard to a citation from Schlegel's novel Lucinda. Quote, "Thinking can find an end least of all in reflective thinking about itself," close quote. But Fichte understood reflection to be meaningful only to the extent that it is limited by a self-positing I, for which thinking becomes an object, and thus a non-I, of reflection. This self-positing act, prior to all thinking of things, including the thing that thinking becomes for the I in reflection, limits reflective thinking in Fichte. Without this limitation, reflection for Fichte means nothing and leads into the void. That's a quote from Benjamin. The act by which the I posits itself before things can be thought, what Fichte describes as the one action of the human mind not contained under all those others, is, as Benjamin points out, quote, the only single case of the fruitful application of reflection, namely that of reflection that occurs in intellectual intuition, close quote. In other words, it is ultimately through the thesis of an original and single reflexive act of positing, in which the I is both subject and object, the I positing the I, that Fichte seeks to assert the Kantian claim of a thinking that produces its object. In this case, the object of the intellectual intuition is what Benjamin calls, quote, second-level reflection, the thinking of thinking, or what is also described as, quote, the canonical form of reflection, as it was recognized by Fichte, close quote, again from Benjamin. The Romantics were fascinated by the infinite potentiality of reflection that was outlined by Fichte in his early writings, and that he proposed to overcome with the thesis of the self-positing I. This fascination led Schlegel to an even more dynamic theory of self-limitation in reflection, specifically the self-limitation, again, Selbstbeschränkung, of art in the form of the work. As the work of art, reflection undergoes a peculiar and even mysterious mode of limitation that takes it beyond the boundaries of the account offered in the Wissenschaftslehre. It is here, Benjamin observes, that the Romantics, quote, part company with Fichte, close quote. Yet this crucial point of departure in what Benjamin insists on calling the Romantic philosophy of reflection is nowhere to be found in the Geschichte der Neueren Philosophie of Windelband. Following the Romantics, therefore, means leaving Windelband behind. There are indeed no authoritative sources on this point of departure, except, that is, the writings of the Romantics themselves. Accordingly, the exposition in the dissertation of the Romantic philosophy of reflection, limiting itself in the work of art, is exclusively a matter of Benjamin's critical reflection on the Romantic sources. Again, very limited number of sources. This interaction leads him to introduce the concept of the work of art as a medium of reflection, a reflexionsmedium, an expression, indeed, as Benjamin himself points out, Schlegel never himself used. As a medium, the work of art for the Romantics gives rise to what Benjamin calls a third level of reflection, to supplement the second level of reflection, another concept not to be found explicitly in any of the sources that Benjamin cites, or in any other sources as far as I'm aware. This is the stage at which the thinking of thinking, the canonical form of reflection according to which the form of thinking becomes its content, turns into the, sorry, this is going to get a little bit dizzying here, the thinking of thinking is third level reflection. The thinking of thinking, when thinking becomes the content and the form of thinking becomes, in the case of Schlegel from Benjamin's point of view, a third level. So the thinking of that thinking of thinking. It may be helpful here to illuminate this third level thinking, the thinking of thinking, to compare this to the effect of holding up a mirror to what is already a mirror image, for example, of canonical reflection. That's not an example that Benjamin gives, but it's one that I'm reaching for to try to get a sense of what is at stake here in this third level. Think if you imagine a mirror image that is then seen in a mirror. It's both the form of the image, but it's also the image itself. Benjamin acknowledges the risk he is running by deciding to introduce this formulation that could appear, as he says, sophistical. But he observes, quote, if one enters into the discussion of the problem of reflection as the context requires, wie sie der Zusammenhang erfordert, then of course subtle distinctions cannot be avoided, close quote. The distinction between the canonical form of reflection and that of the Romantics is that the later instigates what Benjamin calls a disintegration or decomposition, the German here is Zersetzung, of the relation of subject to object, of form to content, that still obtains in second-level reflection according to Fichte's thesis of the self-positing I. This leads to what Benjamin calls a peculiar ambiguity. Reflection in the original or proper sense, according to which thinking becomes the object of thought, turns into both subject and object in third-level reflection. To explain, Benjamin draws on the example of a textual practice that was of endless fascination to him, namely that of citation. A quote here from Benjamin. If one starts from the expression, and here it's quoted in the text, thinking of thinking, then on third level, this is either the object of thought, thinking, parenthetically, or else the thinking subject, the thinking of thinking of thinking. The rigorous original form, Benjamin goes on, of second-level reflection in third-level reflection is assailed and shaken by the ambiguity in third-level reflection, close quote. The effect of third-level reflection is comparable to what happens when the word thinking, what happens to the word thinking when it is cited in the expression, the thinking of thinking, when it becomes a citation. It can no longer be rigorously and exclusively identified as either a subject or an object. The transformation is not simply a matter of turning thinking, in other words, from a content into a form, as it is in second-level reflection. The transformation is, at issue is something other than formal limitation, in other words. This is why Benjamin describes this process as resulting in, quote, the dissolution of the strict form of reflection. Quote, reflection expands without limit or check, and here the word, interestingly, is schrankenlos, and the thinking given form in reflection turns into formless thinking which directs itself toward the absolute, close quote. The ambiguity of thinking in third-level reflection as it becomes formless and absolute corresponds precisely to that of the medium of reflection in Schlegel's theory of art. Benjamin explains in a footnote, quote, "On the one hand, reflection is a medium on the strength of its continuous context. On the other hand, the medium in question is one such that reflection moves within it," close quote. Reflection at once contains, in other words, and is contained by the medium. Like the reversibility, I'm going to cite, make some allusions to other texts by Benjamin that you might be familiar with. In other words, like the reversibility of inside and outside, that was the subject of Benjamin's early essay on the status of the image in Hölderlin's poem Blödigkeit, Timidity, or the way the reversibility of, some of you will remember the image of the sock in the essay on Proust that turns itself inside out. It's an attrape. It's kind of the image. There is also one of the reversibility of inside and outside. And I'm sort of suggesting here that these are linked to this reflection on romantic reflection. As a medium of reflection, art is subject to entanglement in the form of the work. And here the word entanglement, which appears at key points throughout Benjamin's work in this period leading up to when he uses it in the Proust essay as Verschränkung. Verschränkung. So instead of Selbstbeschränkung, it's now Verschränkung, entanglement. This reversibility of inside and outside leads to a kind of entanglement in the work. The romantic theory of the peculiar and mysterious delimitation of art as work holds the key to the concept of criticism developed by Schlegel. Entirely in contrast to conventional views of romanticism, in other words, the work of art in this theory is not at all understood as the product of a subject. The special character of the work for Schlegel derives from what Benjamin designates as its Zusammenhang in two of the passages I've just cited. This word has been translated in each case in the English text as context, but it's difficult to capture its range of significations with one English word. Zusammenhang, of course, derives from the verb zusammenhängen, which literally means to hang together. As a noun, it signifies not just context, but also composition, coherence, perhaps even structure. In the composition's coherence or structure of the work, art is limited in a way that makes possible its completion in criticism, according to Benjamin's theory of romantic criticism. This brings us back to the second authoritative source invoked, this time implicitly by Benjamin's use of the word Vollendung, completion, namely Rickert. Quote from Benjamin: "For the Romantics, criticism is far less the judgment of a work than the method of its consummation." Close quote. For Rickert, Vollendung is the dynamic process through which values are realized, either in the present or in the more elevated sphere of the future, more elevated because, according to Rickert, completion in the future as consummation includes the possibility of drawing closer to what he calls completed totality, whereas completion in the present, again according to Rickert, as dissolution or consumption, bears what Rickert describes as what he calls the curse of finitude. This is from an early essay by Rickert called Vom System. This hierarchy of future over present completion was, as some of you probably know, attacked by Heidegger at the end of a series of lectures on what he calls factical life in Freiburg, beginning in 1919. The dissertation submitted by Benjamin and Baum that same year contained, I would argue, a more covert challenge to Rickert. Rather than elevating the infinite possibility of future consummation over the dead end of present consumption, Benjamin discovers a rethinking of finitude in romantic literary criticism, specifically in the way art is limited as individual work. If art is limited in the structure of the work, we might say criticism delimits precisely by reflecting and, as it were, by returning the limited reflection to the sphere of unlimited reflection that is, according to the Romantics, the idea of art as such. The value of the work consists in its capacity, in other words, to limit reflection in a way that enables it, however, to be opened up up, and unlimited in criticism, not progressively as in Rickert's theory, but repeatedly. Thus, as if to correct Rickert after describing again critical reflection as the Vollendung of the work, in the passage I cited at the beginning of this paper, Benjamin states, quote, "The value of a work depends solely on whether it makes immanent criticism possible or not. If this is possible, if there is present in the work a reflection that can unfold itself, absolutize itself, and resolve itself in the medium of art, then it is a work of art. The mere criticizability of a work demonstrates the positive value judgment made about it." The distance separating Benjamin from conventional Germanistic, to return to my initial comment from Wellick on this point, is illustrated by the paragraph that immediately follows Benjamin's invocation of Novalis on criticism's completion of the work. It begins with the citation of a 1913 study of Friedrich Schlegel by the Bonn Germanist Karl Enders that attributes to the Schlegel family responsibility for overcoming the dogmatism of neoclassical aesthetics and awakening what Enders calls the, quote, "modern critical spirit based on a respect for the unique sovereignty of the productive creative power of the artist and thinker," close quote from Enders. What Enders does not mention, Benjamin observes almost in passing, is that for Friedrich Schlegel, the member of the family most responsible for this achievement, the critical spirit overcomes not only aesthetic dogmatism, the aesthetic dogmatism of the neoclassical canon, but also what Benjamin characterizes as, quote, "the boundless cult of creative power understood as the mere expressive force of their creator," close quote. In this way, according to Benjamin, Schlegel surpassed both neoclassical rationalism and the cult of Sturm und Drang that continues to affect literary criticism, according to Benjamin, in the 19th and the 20th centuries, as Enders' approach to Schlegel illustrates. Overlooked by the latter is that with Friedrich Schlegel, the critical spirit secures a position for criticism that elevates it above that of a minority tolerated skeptically by what Enders calls in the passage cited the exclusive sovereignty of the productive creative force of the artist and the thinker. Schlegel, Benjamin argues, quote, "fixed the laws of the spirit into the work of art itself instead of making the latter into a mere byproduct of subjectivity," close quote. In this sense, the title of the dissertation takes on a second meaning. The concept of German Romantic criticism, what Benjamin in this same passage calls its fundamental concept, the Grundbegriff, is the work. With his concept of the work of art as a center of reflection, Schlegel, quote from Benjamin, "secured from the side of the object or structure that very autonomy in the domain of art that Kant in the Third Critique had lent to the power of judgment," close quote. The objectivity, in other words, is in the work itself as a medium of reflection. It's not a matter of values, as the Neo-Kantians were arguing. It's in the work itself. Benjamin's analysis of this objectivity may be understood as a critical response not only to the conventional Germanistic accounts of Romantic literature with their emphasis on art as an expression of the subjectivity of the creative artist, but also to the contemporary efforts in philosophy to establish the objectivity of cultural science or the human sciences on the basis of Kant, the project that was being carried out by Windelband, Rickert, and Weber. The objectivity of the Romantic concept of criticism derives from the immanent structure of the work, and in particular from the former's capacity to release reflection in the latter, according to Benjamin. This is not a matter of the subjective power of the critic to provide a judgment of the work. It is an objective reflection, not a subjective reflection. The objectivity of the work of art consists in a formal structure, therefore, that both limits and allows for the extension of reflection. Criticism reflects the formal inflection of the work, and in this sense breaks down or decomposes the form of the work. Yet critical reflection does not simply overcome limitation in the manner of the creative artists championed by Sturm und Drang and Enders later on. Instead, Romantic criticism is drawn into an objective process of extending a reflexive medium that is rigorously limited. Quote, In order for criticism to be the suspension of all limitation, Benjamin observes, the work must rest on limitation, close quote. Much more would have to be said about the singularly objective character of this critical reflection. But in the interest of time, let me close by observing that the medium of this objective reflection is repeatedly associated by Benjamin with life, more rigorously with a concept of life that is interpenetrated with death, with finitude. The formal limitation of the work of art that is broken down and annihilated in criticism is, as Benjamin writes, quote, a living center of reflection, close quote. And here the word living is lebendiges. By decomposing the formal character of the work, critical reflection exposes and is exposed to the objectivity of life. Criticism is thus a mode of survival, in German here, Überleben, as Benjamin puts it in a key passage on critical romantic irony. In this sense, ultimately, the romantic concept of criticism for Benjamin is a matter of life and death. Thank you.